Hello, thanks for watching. Today is our Sunday School lesson review for Joshua chapter 22. We just covered one chapter this week, and so this should be a very fairly short video to review Joshua 22. So, to review, to get us to this point, the Hebrews have conquered Canaan. In the last review that we had, in the last chapters that we studied, the land has been divided amongst all of the tribes. The cities have been divided. The Levites have been given their cities. And so, in essence, the work of conquering Canaan is complete. And so Joshua brings together the tribe of the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, these ones that have decided that they were going to settle on the eastern side of the Jordan River. If you remember back in our study of the book of Numbers, I think chapter 32 or so, they had asked Moses if it would have been fine for them to settle on the east side, on the east side of the Jordan River, and they were granted that with the condition that they would help fight with their brothers, the other Hebrews, in the conquering of Canaan. And so they've done that. As Joshua mentions here in chapter 22, he commends these 2.5 tribes for their work and their diligence to help bring Canaan under captivity of the Hebrews. And so Joshua brings them together to give them a farewell address, if you will, because now these 2.5 tribes are going to cross back over the Jordan River onto the east side so that they can settle in their land. In chapter 22, verse 5, Joshua tells them, "Take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, charged you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling unto him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all of your soul." Joshua gives them this command more or less because he was afraid, and I think perhaps the Hebrews' entirety were afraid that this Jordan River was going to become a natural boundary to cut off these 2.5 tribes from the other 9.5 tribes. And so Joshua is giving these final commands as a way to anchor these 2.5 tribes to the rest of their brothers on the west side of the Jordan River. And it says there in verse 6 that Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went into their tents. And so we see here the 2.5 tribes are preparing to cross back over. It says in verse 8, it mentions the spoils of war and the many cattle and the brass and the silver and the gold and all these things that God had blessed them with because of their help to conquer Canaan. And so God had thoroughly blessed them. And so now that they're preparing to go, it says in verse 11, "And the children of Israel heard say, Behold, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar over against the land of Canaan in the borders of Jordan at the passage of the children of Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, the whole congregation of the children of Israel gathered themselves together at Shiloh to go to war against them." So we see these 2.5 tribes build an altar. In my study, I kind of just had this thought that perhaps what these 2.5 tribes built was a replica of the altar that God had commanded to be built and placed in the tabernacle. We'll see later in this chapter that this altar was a big, massive altar to be able to be seen for faraway places. But the 9.5 tribes take offense to it. They're threatened that this altar is a copy, or is going to be a place to hold sacrifices and burnt offerings and that type of thing. And so it says there in verse 12 that the 9.5 tribes were going to go to war against the 2.5 tribes. And so a delegation led by Phinehas, it goes to the 2.5 tribes to get an explanation as to what's going on. What does this altar represent? Why are you building this altar? And we see here, essentially, so this delegation led by Phinehas, as we read in verse 17, they're afraid and they recall what had happened back in, Numbers chapter 25, when Israel became involved in the worship of Baal at Peor, and how God had punished the Hebrews and had killed many thousands of them because of the sin that they took up at Peor. And so these 9.5 tribes are afraid that these 2.5 tribes are going to again turn to follow and to worship false gods, and this altar that they've built is an act of defiance or an act of idol worship in the minds of the 9.5 tribes. And so the 9.5 tribes, the delegation comes, and the 2.5 tribes make it clear that this was not to be an altar to worship at. Was not to be an altar that was going to have sacrifices. It was merely an altar built as a memorial and as a reminder that they belong to the tribes that are on the west side of the Jordan River. So it was more or less a memorial. But we see here the interest of the 9.5 tribes to protect the holiness of God, the interest that it took for them to go to battle. They were prepared to go to battle against their brothers, the 2.5 tribes, to keep the holiness of God pure, to keep the worship of God pure, to keep the tabernacle and the altar of God pure. And it was only after a nice and a good explanation by the 2.5 tribes does the tensions cease and the tensions melt down to where the 9.5 tribes accept the explanation given by the 2.5 tribes. And you can read through the rest of the chapter here how they come to an agreement and how they understood that this altar was not necessarily to be an altar to sacrifice on, but it was an altar of memorial. But I do believe that perhaps this was a replica in a larger sense of what had been in the temple, and so that's why they recognized it as an altar. That is our review of chapter 22. It takes some time to read through that and kind of get a better idea of the understanding that the tribes had amongst themselves. But I think you get the gist of the lesson that we covered today in Sunday school. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate it.